Thank you, Saskia. Ladies and gentlemen. So a century of Australian natural disasters, and I guess and what we might do about them. I think a subtext for this talk would be, let's focus on the risks as we understand it now, and less on the marginal changes that climate change may eventually bring. Just a word on risk frontiers. A lot of our work is for the insurance industry, helping them understand and price natural catastrophe risk in our region, and I mention that because I think insurance is one part of the solution space for reducing the losses. One of the things that we've done over the last 30 years is develop a comprehensive database of natural hazard events that have either caused loss of life or material loss of property. This is the loss of life. It's been normalised by population, so it's on a common footing. And what you see is a decreasing death toll over time, and this is true of most parts of the world. The heat waves contribute more than half of these losses. It's a peril that doesn't get a lot of attention in Australia, nonetheless, and I think that's because old people dying alone don't make good television. So that's what the death toll looks like. This is, if you look at the inset, this is in the dollars of the day, insurance losses starting in 1967. And you'll see this almost exponential rise up to 2011, and in the early part of that, certainly people were attributing that as a signal of climate change. But if you really want to compare these losses, you have to put them on a common basis, and I think Megan already mentioned the things that are important: population, wealth and inflation. In the bottom is the normalised losses. So what we're trying to do is say, if these events all happened in 2011, what would be the cost? And in our case, we've adjusted for the change in the number of dwellings, the changes in the value of those dwellings, less the value of the land, the fact that newer houses tend to be bigger than older ones, and something that's really important in our area is that for homes, newer homes in tropical cyclone-prone parts of the country are a lot less vulnerable because of improved building codes that came in after the destruction of Darwin in 1974. So what we see is no trend. We see a lot of inter-annual variation and some cyclical patterns that correspond quite well to the El Nino-La Nina cycle, particularly on the east coast where a lot of Australia's population live. Now the last two ones there haven't been normalised, but they don't make much difference to the pattern. So no, once we adjust for more assets, more wealth, for demography, then there really is no residual signal that we could ascribe to climate change or anything else. Now, this is all weather-dependent hazards. If we look at bushfires, which some of you may think is more likely to show a trend, it's the same picture. In the inset there, we see no increase. We see an increase in the numbers of homes destroyed over time, starting in 1926 when we had the first really big losses of last century. And once you normalise this, it's a fairly easy process. We just have to adjust by the changing number of homes. We see no trend again. Now, it's fair to say some people initially didn't like this result. They thought it should be going up because of climate change. One of the criticisms or questions was asked, well, we're much better at putting out fires now, but in fact that's not the true. Most of the losses happen in a very few fires that under conditions where it's really not possible for emergency services to affect the outcome. The other thing they argue is that we've got much better warning systems now, and that's certainly true. In the 2009 fires, The meteorological predictions from the Bureau of Meteorology were almost perfect, down to the timing of wind changes, but we still lost 173 people because really it doesn't seem to change people's behaviour very much. Now that's all been intensity. You hear a lot less about frequency. This is going back to the Peril Oz database, and what we've done is normalised these and then used a threshold, a fairly large threshold, so we're confident that they'll be in our database, that the possibility of not reporting on these is very unlikely. It's not sensitive. If we used a lower threshold, we get the same result. But again, we see no trend over time from 1950. From 1900 to 1950, we do see a gradual increase, which is due to increased reporting and people living in places where they didn't previously. So, now this really isn't controversial, or it shouldn't be, because the IPCC has finally capitulated to the wealth of data. There's some 40 different studies in different parts of the world that all show the same thing, that basically losses are going up because there's more people living in places prone to natural disasters and with more to lose. They have the disclaimer there, if you like, that they can't rule out climate change, and that's certainly true, but if you can't measure it, it's not very useful for policy. And coming back to insurance again, this was a study from the London School of Economics, funded by one of the larger reinsurance companies, and this was their conclusion, that the insurance industry really isn't very vulnerable to this. There's another reason why they're not vulnerable, and that is because they assess risk on an annual basis. They don't give out 80-year contracts. So if what we can't see, neither we nor anyone else can see a signal of climate change, it's a fair question to ask how long it will be until we do. Oh, sorry, I'm getting a bit of my head of myself, but let me just visualise some of the changes that are going on. This is a slide from Roger Pilkey Jr., who's been responsible for a lot of the early work and a collaborator of ours. This shows Miami Beach in 1926, before a hurricane that went through, which, if it was to recur today, given what Miami looks like now, is estimated by Roger and many other commentators to think about these things, to have economic losses of greater than $150 billion. And of course in Australia it's the same. This is the Gold Coast, now a popular international tourist area. We can't find any pictures from 1926 because I think there probably wasn't anything to photograph. And so the 1970 is the earliest, but again you see a very different urban landscape. This starts the Brisbane floods in 2011. The quotation on the top comes from Gilbert White, who was one of the early academics to really look seriously at floods. And his view was that we had to accommodate them rather than just trying to search for engineering solutions. The red outline there is the footprint of those floods in 2011, and the white stuff is where very old mapping, about 30 years old in this case, said it should flood for a flood of that depth. So there's no real secret there, and again, the red outline would be very similar, is very similar to the 1974 floods. What's changed in that time is that in 1974 there were somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 homes affected, and in 2011 there were in excess of 30,000 insurance claims of impacted homes, and of course a lot of people didn't actually have insurance for flood at that time. So basically, the cost of this disaster can come back to really poor land use planning. And this is also true for bushfires in Australia. This shows the two most affected towns in the 2009 fires. So this is Marysville, which was almost completely destroyed, and this is King Lake. And the grey part shows you satellite imagery indicating the extension of the bushland. The red is obviously destroyed homes, and the black circles ones that survived. Now the key message is up there in these statistics. 25% of those homes were actually in the bush. They were surrounded or had trees up to 30 metres high right up against the homes. And under those conditions, there's almost no chance of defending the homes, although a lot of people died trying. So again, it comes back to, in my view, poor land use planning. Now, going back to where I started a few moments ago, that we can't see a signal of climate change, so how long might it be? I'm not going to go through the study in any detail, it's quite complex, but basically we've turned to the US rather than to Australia because we've got better economic loss data going back to 1900, so that's that there. We also have better downscaling modelling on what warming might do to hurricane activity from the Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Laboratory at Princeton. And essentially we combine that and do a bootstrapping analysis to see how long it will be before we're absolutely confident that there is a climate change signal in the loss data. And the answer is something like 260 years, and that's if we take a 18 model ensemble. If we use the individual ones, we get quite a big range. Now just let me be clear what this is and what it isn't. It isn't saying that we don't need to worry about climate change because it's about 260 years before it kicks in. It's not saying that at all. It's saying that's the measure of really the signal to noise ratio. If you're trying to find a climate change signal in the loss data, which is notoriously variable, that's how long you'd have to wait. And this won't be the last word on this. In fact, Kerry Emanuel from MIT has come out with a study and got slightly lower numbers, but still considerably long. So let's sort of come to wrapping up. I liked the first couple of talks because they talked about the social science contribution to this problem. I've headed this with a quotation from myself. At my age, I'm sort of hoping it's true that death only happens to other people. But it sums up what I think the social science conclusions of a large number of studies that some of our colleagues have done. And one is that after the Victorian fires, we interviewed hundreds of survivors. We found one, I think they found one couple that weren't aware that these were some of the worst fire conditions on record or heading up to that. It changed almost nobody's behaviour, and we still had that loss of life. After the 2011 Brisbane floods, we interviewed again lots of victims, and very few of those people, I think 14%, were contemplating building their home in a more resilient fashion. I think the proportion of those who actually did it is probably very, very low. Most people, if they had received money from handouts from government or insurance, were going to modernise their kitchen. And there's lots of studies, some of them have been alluded to before, that people don't really think very much about low probability events. Life sort of gets in the way. But I think so to my view, there has to be some sort of compulsion if we're to arrest this increase, and that needs to come at the local government level, because local governments have really got only two ways of raising money. One is to raise taxes, which are unpopular, and or to release land for development. So they have the responsibility really, and certainly in Australia very little effort is put into trying to consider risks. So in summary, the losses are increasing due to increasing exposure and wealth, basically more stuff in harm's way. it's going to be a long time before we can pick out a climate change signal in these time series of losses, so I think we should focus on the immediate problem. There really isn't any mystery for where these losses will occur. I mean, things like Christchurch obviously was a surprise, and Tohoku, but very generally, you know, it floods, water runs downhill and collects in the low parts of the landscape, so it's not a surprise. And in bushfire, if you build in Victoria in the bush, then sooner or later you're going to have to deal with it. So the tools really are very prosaic. Risk-informed land use planning. I think insurers play a role here in trying to assess risk properly and sending a signal to all parties about the nature of the peril. Hazard resilient building codes have worked really well in Australia for tropical cyclones, and in New Zealand, even in the Christchurch example, where ground motions in the CBD were twice double the building code level, most buildings survive pretty well. And flood defences, as long as they're combined with sensible land use planning. And once again, I think it sort of comes back to that local council level, but I don't underestimate the political issues that you have to deal with. Thank you.